our next talk in the new work on paradoxes online conference at the University of Bucharest is Mr. William Nava. Mr. Nava is coming from New York University, and his talk today is titled Non-classicality All the Way Up. And if I'm not mistaken, William has delivered a prequel of this talk at the alethic group, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the new installment. I'm sure he's coded in at least a couple of the questions he's gotten there. Those were amazing. And so, William, we're very much looking forward, and please take it
away. Thank you. And yes, this is very much a version of the talk I gave at the Aleph seminar. So apologies for those who already heard that talk. There's a lot of overlap, but also some changes and also significantly streamlined. So with all that said, let me see about sharing my screen. Hold on just a moment. Okay. Do people see this? Yes. Okay, great. Let me make sure that this is working. Great. Okay. Yeah, I'll get right into it. So it's a kind of familiar, often remarked fact about non-classical logics, pretty much all non-classical logics that have been proposed as solutions to paradox or otherwise, that their consequence relations in some way behave classically. So take, for example, the logic K3. The law of excluded middle is not valid for K3. However, it is valid for statements about K3 validity. So you can assume the law of excluded middle when you're just talking about what follows in K3. And in fact, you can assume all classical rules and laws when you're just reasoning about what follows in K3. This fact of sort of the validity relation itself behaving classically, I'm going to call being meta-classical. And again, basically all non-classical logics that have been seriously proposed and seriously studied are meta-classical in this sense. And so one of the things that I want to do in this talk is introduce a kind of very abstract general framework for investigating the space of logics that are not meta-classical, right? To give us a sort of framework for even considering and looking into the structure of logics that are not meta-classical in this way. So now, in particular, in this talk, what I want to do is two things. One is to introduce this notion of meta-classicality in a somewhat more precise way, and actually extend it to a notion of meta-n-classicality for arbitrary n. And that's kind of, again, by way of just introducing a general framework. And then I want to quickly give an argument for the claim that the correct universal logic, and I'll say what I mean by that in a moment, is not meta-n-classical for any n. Now, I haven't told you really what meta-n-classicality means yet, so that shouldn't be quite clear what that means. But in effect, what it'll mean is that the correct universal logic is non-classical in, as robust a way as you can have in the kind of framework I'm going to propose. So before I get into this, let me first go over some quick preliminaries. First, logic is always kind of relative to some notion of logical form, which amounts to some choice of the vocabulary that you're going to consider the logical vocabulary. And I'm going to assume a fairly standard first order logic plus identity understanding of this. And I'm also going to assume that a logic, properly so called, satisfies a rule of substitution for non-logical vocabulary. So you choose the logical vocabulary, and then you assume, whatever the logic is, you can substitute non-logical terminology, and you would still have the resulting sentence either be in the logic or not in the logic. And then also, by way of kind of clarifying some things, you often hear people talk about the logic of a certain phenomenon, like the logic of truth or the logic of vagueness. And I'm going to use this kind of talk as well. So I want to say a little bit about what I mean by that. So for me, when I talk about the logic of some phenomenon phi, I'm referring to the best logic that is compatible with the characteristic behavior of whatever vocabulary is needed to make claims about the phenomenon phi. So accordingly, a logic is then a relation on sentences in a language that have the ability to make claims about phi. And to be a bit more concrete, the logic of truth would then be, for example, the best logic compatible with the characteristic behavior of, say, the truth predicate. When I say the best logic, there may not be only one logic. In fact, usually there won't be only one logic that satisfies this compatibility requirement. So, well, then you do some philosophy to figure out which is the best. And I'm being completely non-committal about what is involved in that. I'm just trying to put in this compatibility requirement. And by compatible, I mean that the logic plus the characteristic behavior of the vocabulary, when put together, does not give you triviality, does not allow you to prove everything. Now, though I say that the logic of phi must be compatible with the characteristic of phi vocabulary, it will not, in fact, reflect it in the sense of actually validating that behavior, since that would violate the substitution requirement that I gave earlier. So for example, let's say you think that the truth predicate is transparent. So you think that a rule like A, therefore A is true, is a good rule in some sense, like that is how truth behaves. Then the logic of truth should be compatible with that rule, in the sense that if you were to add that rule, you would not get triviality. However, the logic of truth does not validate that rule because that would violate the substitution requirement. So we do want this to be a logic in the sense of only being sensitive to logical terminology. Now with this notion of being a logic of in place, I'll just say that logic simpliciter, which is another term I'll use for what I earlier called the universal logic, is just the logic of arbitrary phenomena. So it's the best logic compatible with the characteristic behavior of whatever vocabulary we would need in order to make arbitrary claims about anything that can be expressed. Okay, with this kind of preliminary material out of the way, let me now try to introduce this notion of meta-classicality. And let me start by asking the question, suppose that you've got a logic that governs some language L0. How do we investigate the logic of that logic? And in accordance with what I just said a minute ago, the idea is you need a language that has the resources to express claims about that logic. And the simplest way to do that is to have a language in which you have a predicate that corresponds to validity of that logic. So that's this kind of double arrow 0 predicate, and names of sentences of the language that that logic governs. If you then add logical vocabulary, so you can make logically complex sentences from that sort of starting material, that then allows you to reason about that 0 validity predicate. And we can call that the language, the results L1. And now we can say that there's going to be a logic of that language. That'll be, we can call that double arrow 1, and that will be sort of the logic of double arrow 0. And we can now, of course, ask, what is the logic of the double arrow one logic? And it's kind of clear that we're at the bottom of the beginning of a hierarchy. So let me put this in somewhat more general terms. Let's say you have a starting language, L0. Then we can define a hierarchy of languages in the following way. You just say that if ln is a language, then ln plus 1 is a language that consists of logical vocabulary, the predicate double arrow sub n as the only non-logical predicate, and names of finite sets of sentences of ln. And of course, I'm being a bit lazy here. What I should have here is kind of the formation rules for this language, but you can just take this to be the standard ones given the logical vocabulary that I've said, is the vocabulary I'm calling logical. And then on a kind of standard interpretation of these languages, the idea is that the double arrow n plus 1 predicate is supposed to represent the logic of the logic that corresponds to the double arrow sub n. So it's a hierarchy of languages, each of which is about the logic of the previous one, with the bottom one again just being the logic of whatever, some given language L0. With this in place, we can define meta-n classicality, actually the more general notion of meta-n classicality right away. And the definition basically just says that if you've got a logic somewhere in this hierarchy, that logic is meta-n classical if the logic n places higher up in that hierarchy is classical logic. And so, if the starting logic, the zero validity one, if the logic of that is classical logic, then the 0 one we say is meta 1 classical. If the logic of it is classical logic, then we can say that's meta 2 classical, and so on. And then the meta 1 classicality kind of corresponds to the intuitive notion of just meta-classicality, with which I started the talk. Now, with all that said, assuming, as I take it, we do that classical logic is meta 1 classical, that is, you can reason classically about classical logic, it follows that if you start with classical logic in this hierarchy, then it'll be meta 1 classical. But since the one level is classical logic, the logic of that is also classical logic. So it'll also be meta 2 classical, and so on up. So we have our first kind of easy result, which just says that if a logic is meta k classical, then it will be meta m classical for all m greater than or equal to k. Basically, if you, at any point you hit classical logic, it'll be classical logic the rest of the way up. And this is a kind of instance of a sort of more general kind of fixed point observation, which is that if at any point in this hierarchy, n and n plus 1 are the same logic, then you'll have that same logic for the rest of the way up. With this definition, we can now divide logics into 4 main grades of non-classicality. And they are as follows. So grade 0 is where the least n at which you are meta n classical is 0. So this applies only to classical logic by the definition of meta n classicality. Grade 1 is where the least n, where you're meta n classical, is 1. So this applies to all the standard kind of familiar non-classical logics. Basically, any non-classical logic that is introduced explicitly in a classical meta theory is grade 1 on this definition. Grade 2 are logics that are meta n classical for some n, but the least n is greater than 1. Of course, within grade 2, you can have gradations, of course, depending on what the least n is. And that actually does end up corresponding to a somewhat intuitive kind of measure of meta-theoretic distance from classicality. But that's something I won't have time to get into today. And then grade 3 are logics that are not meta and classical for any n. So no matter how much meta you go up in your theorizing, you're not going to be able to hit classical logic at any level. Now, I have some slides here about grade 2 and grade 3 logic, but I'm going to skip them in the interest of time and move on to the main argument that I promised at the beginning, which is that the universal logic or logic simpliciter is grade 3. So now that I've introduced the 4 grades, but third being the highest, I hope it's clear that what this claim amounts to. In effect, it amounts to the correct universal logic being non-classical all the way up. Now, to motivate this claim, I'm going to first start by making a distinction between 3 different conceptions of logic. And on the first of these conceptions, an argument is valid if there's a derivation from the premises to the conclusion. So we can think of this as a kind of constructive conception of logic. On the second, an argument is valid is if there's a special kind of normative constraint on our mental states or on our actions involving the premises and the conclusion. So I have in mind here the kind of definitions of consequence that go something like, it is, there's a prohibition against accepting all the premises and rejecting all the conclusions. Things like that would be instances of this normative conception. And then there's a third conception, which I call the alethic one, which says roughly that an argument is valid if the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion, where guarantees carries some distinctly logical modal force. So the first thing I want to say about these conceptions, these 3 conceptions, is that they're all sort of different enough from each other and sufficiently of interest that we should consider them all notions in good standing, as opposed to rival candidates for the account of one single phenomenon. So it may well be that there are interesting connections between them. It may well be that under certain natural specifications, they're coextensive. Nevertheless, they're all sort of interesting notions in their own right, sort of worthy of investigation and study. And then specifically about the alethic conception, I want to say, one, that there's a very rich history behind it, and that there's a sort of strong traditions of considering it as the notion of logic, going back at least to the medieval period of logic, if not before. And 2, that perhaps it has the strongest claim to being the pre-theoretic notion of logic. And I say all these things, slightly defensively, because for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus in on the alethic conception. And I do know that there are people who kind of just say, well, the alethic conception is just the wrong conception of what logic is, so we can throw it out. And I want to say we shouldn't throw any of these out. They're all kind of interesting on their own terms. And actually, the alethic conception is pre-theoretically of quite significant interest. So again, I'm going to now just focus in on the alethic conception. And when I say that logic is grade 3, I mean logic as understood under the alethic conception. So now, narrowing in on the alethic conception, it is often glossed as necessary truth preservation. We can take it to basically involve 3 components: truth, preservation, and some distinctly logical notion of necessity. And the argument I'm going to make will actually only involve claims of logical truth. So we don't have to worry about the preservation aspect of this. Which means, in effect, that logical truth on this alethic conception is just a certain kind of alethic necessity. Now, I'm going to make a certain assumption about this necessity, which in a way is the most important assumption for my argument. So I'm going to kind of try to spell that out as clearly as I can. And I'm going to say that this necessity is a modal strengthening of truth in the precise sense that it can be understood as truth in all ways of varying actuality, given some space of admissible variations. So here's what I mean by that. I take it that when we say that something is a certain claim is logically true, what we're saying is something like this. Not only is this claim true, but it is true in a way that is independent of a whole lot. In fact, it's independent of everything other than its distinctly logical features. And we can cash this out as saying it is true in every way of varying everything other than those distinctly logical features. So if you accept this account of this notion of necessity, we have, in effect, a definition of logical truth, where we just say that A is logically true if it is true at all points. Points is just the term I'm using for these variations. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm doing here when I give you this definition. So what I've done is given you a kind of conceptual analysis. And it is intentionally an open-ended one. So I have said really next to nothing about what these points are or how they behave. And that's on purpose. It's because I'm doing conceptual analysis, and I think that conceptual analysis can only really get you so far. I don't think that conceptual analysis can pin down a unique logic or a unique notion of what it is that we are allowed to vary and how it behaves in this conception, under this alethic conception of logic. However, I do think that conceptual analysis gives you that logic, has to satisfy a definition of the shape that I gave you. And then there's still a question of specifying some of the open parameters of how it actually behaves. And my point is that that allows us to still place constraints on what the correct logic might be, even if it may not give us an exact extension or something like that. Now, with that said, the following two assumptions are kind of already implicit in in the analysis that I gave of the alethic conception of logic. One is that there's an actual point, and two, that truth in the actual point is equivalent to truth simpliciter. So let me briefly defend these, although again, I take it to them that they're just kind of implicit in the analysis I gave of the alethic conception. But again, I said, logical truth is truth in all the ways of varying everything other than the distinctly logical features. Surely actuality is among those ways of admissible ways of varying everything other than the logical features. And as to the second one, this analysis only makes sense if this relation I've been calling, truth in is a kind of generalization of truth. And I think that we can kind of codify this point that it has to be a generalization of truth by saying that we can define truth as truth in actuality. And the second assumption there just kind of codifies that. So with that said, I'm going to just go over some terminology I'll be using in the main argument. So I'm going to call sentences that are not closed under all classical rules non-bivalent. And I'll say that sentences that are bivalently true or false are plain true or plain false. I'll call two sentences equivalent if they're both plain true, both plain false, or both non-bivalent. And I'm going to use lambda as my symbol for the liar sentence. And then I'm going to make use of some assumptions that I don't take to just be built into the alethic conception of logic, but are more substantive assumptions. Nonetheless, I think they are plausible. One is that truth is transparent. The next is that if a sentence is non-bivalent, the excluded middle instance of that sentence is also non-bivalent. Third is that the claim that an instance of excluded middle is true at some point is never plain false for any point. And four, a universal claim is non-bivalent if no instance of it is plain false and at least one instance is non-bivalent. So I don't really have the time to defend these assumptions. I think they are defensible. But let me just quickly say that, well, the first one is, of course, just often supposed to be the kind of characteristic assumption about truth. The second and fourth are true of K3 and LP, which I take to be, well, really the kind of, if you want to stay, if you don't want to go substructural, they're basically the only plausible non-classical approaches to semantic paradox. And the third, though it doesn't hold of K3 and LP as stated, because you don't define K3 and LP with this truth in relation, there's an obvious analog that holds for K3 and LP, which is that K3 and LP models never assign an instance of the law of excluded middle the value 0 in the 3-valued kind of system. So now onto the actual argument. It's an argument by induction, and the idea is to show that if you start with what I've called the universal logic or logic simpliciter as the bottom level of the hierarchy I defined earlier, then at every level of the hierarchy, there will be some sentence A such that A or not A is invalid. That sentence is non-bivalent. So I'll give the argument now. The base case is as follows. Because the bottom level is logic simpliciter, the language it governs is one that can express anything that can be expressed. So it includes a liar sentence. It is non-bivalent for familiar reasons. And then by the assumption that if a sentence is non-bivalent, so is the excluded middle instance, then lambda or not lambda is also non-bivalent. Now the claim that lambda or not lambda is true at M, where M is some point, is not plain false for any point. However, the claim that it is true at the actual point is equivalent to the simple true description of it. That was the assumption I made about how the actual point behaves. And then by the transparency of truth, that just means that it is equivalent to lambda or not lambda itself. So the claim that lambda or not lambda is true at the actual point is non-bivalent. And then by the assumption I made about how universal claims work, that means that the claim that lambda or not lambda is true at all points is non-bivalent. And that is the definition of lambda or not lambda is 0 valid. So that claim that lambda or not lambda is 0 valid is a non-bivalent claim. For the inductive step, what you do is that you assume there's some A such that A or not A is invalid. That sentence is non-bivalent. And then you run more or less the same kind of argument that we ran at the base step. So you just take the excluded middle instance of that whole sentence. A or not A is invalid. The excluded middle instance will also be non-bivalent, which means that the claim that it's true in the actual point will be non-bivalent. The claim that it's true at a certain point will never be plain false for any point. So the claim that is true at all points will be non-bivalent. And that is just the definition of the claim that that sentence is n+1 valid. So that completes that argument. Strictly speaking, the argument just shows that there is some A such that this holds at every level. But if these are all logics so that they satisfy the rule of substitution, we should actually expect that they would hold for any A. And in order to get that, you just have to kind of add an extra assumption about the how the points work, which roughly is just that for any pair of predicates, there will be some point so that if one predicate behaves in a kind of special way at the actual point, then for any other predicate, there will be some point that treats it as that other predicate behaves at the actual point. And this is a very natural assumption. Again, if what you're taking yourself to be defining is a logic and it coheres with this kind of analysis that I gave of the alethic conception of logic. So then to kind of recapitulate, the result is just that the law of excluded middle is the claim that the law of excluded middle is invalid is a non-bivalent claim at every level of the hierarchy generated when you start with your bottom level logic as just the correct universal logic. Because of that, at every level, there's a sentence that is non-bivalent. And so the logic of that cannot be classical logic, which means that no level in the hierarchy can be classical logic, so that every logic in the hierarchy, including the bottom one, is grade 3. Notice that this argument only gets off the ground because we have a liar sentence in the object language. So it would not apply to sentences that don't have a truth predicate. And so you can take a kind of you can take the argument in a kind of slogan form to just say that transparent truth, in fact, forces non-classicality all the way up. Let me end by saying how I think we can kind of intuitively understand what this argument is telling us. So many people think that truth kind of forces us to abandon classical logic, to weaken classical logic. But there's this kind of hope that if we can keep truth out, we might still be able to reason about logic classically, even the logic of truth, so long as we keep truth itself out of the language that we're reasoning with about the logic of truth. And what this argument is trying to show is that in some senses it's too optimistic. So long as a logic is actually adequate to be a logic of truth, then any logic of that logic will be such that in some sense the non-classicality of truth will kind of infect the higher level language, even if that language doesn't itself have a truth predicate. And this is because of a sort of important conceptual tie between logic and truth. And okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and I'm sure everyone in the audience joins me in applauding your work. Thank you. Great, and now we move on to Q&A.